The frost cracked under Maya's boots, a sound like tiny bones snapping in the pre-dawn stillness. It was always coldest just before the light bled back into the world, a time that felt suspended between endings and beginnings she no longer trusted. The smell hit her next, layered and complex. The sharp tang of old hay dust, the lingering ghost of wood smoke that never quite left the rebuilt barn, and beneath it all, the damp, earthy scent of horses. Except now, there was only one. The Zia February wind, sharp as a farrier's knife, whistled through the empty stalls, rattling loose boards and carrying whispers of the life that used to fill this place. What do you do when the only thing left of someone you loved is a horse they left behind? She didn't go into the barn itself. Not yet. Instead, she leaned against the rough-hewn post beside the small, fenced-off paddock attached to the rebuilt structure. Her grandfather had insisted on adding it, a private run for the mare who'd been expecting. For the future, he'd said, his eyes crinkling. Now, the future stood alone in the center of that frosted patch of earth, a shadow sculpted from the lingering night. Maya's breath plumed white in the air. Her hands, shoved deep into the pockets of her worn barn coat, were numb. Not just from the cold. It was the emptiness. The echoing silence where her grandfather's booming laugh and the comforting shuffle of hooves used to be. 3 months. A lifetime compressed into a single shattering night. She hadn't cried since the funeral. The tears felt frozen somewhere deep inside, a glacier of grief she couldn't begin to melt. She just moved through the motions of keeping the farm alive, a ghost tending ghosts. The foal didn't move. He was a dark shape against the gray dawn, head down, legs planted wide as if braced against an invisible storm. He wasn't sleeping. Maya could feel the coiled tension radiating from him even from 10 feet away. He'd been like this since the fire. Barely a week old when the world exploded in heat and terror. Her grandfather pulling him from the collapsing stall, the mare lost to the smoke. The foal tucked under his arm like a singed, trembling parcel. The old man had coughed for weeks after, a wet, rattling sound Maya could still hear in her nightmares, a sound that had eventually stolen his breath for good. And the foal? He'd survived. He'd eaten, grown, learned to walk steadily, but he hadn't lived. He hadn't known anything but the smell of smoke and loss. He lifted his head a fraction, just enough for the first weak light to catch the curve of his near hind hoof. It was the only part of him that seemed truly present, a polished mahogany brown against the charcoal gray of his coat. Maya stared at that hoof. It was the hoof she'd first seen that night, protruding from the blanket her grandfather had wrapped him in, impossibly small, impossibly vulnerable amidst the chaos. It felt like a relic, the only physical proof left of her grandfather's final, desperate act of love. A gust of wind swirled dead leaves across the paddock. The foal flinched, a violent shudder rippling through his entire body. His head snapped up, ears pinned flat back, nostrils flaring wide as he sucked in the cold air. He wasn't looking at the leaves. He was staring past Maya, past the fence, towards the blackened scar on the earth where the old barn had stood. His eyes, wide and dark as spilled ink, held a terror so primal it made Maya's own breath catch. He stood frozen again, trembling, a statue of fear. Slowly, deliberately, Maya slid her hands out of her pockets. She kept them low, palms open and facing slightly away. She made no sound, didn't call his name. He didn't have one. Naming him felt like an invitation to a future she wasn't sure either of them deserved. She took one step towards the paddock gate. The hinges groaned, a low, metallic complaint in the quiet. The foal's head whipped towards the sound. His eyes locked onto hers. Not aggression, pure, unadulterated panic. He took 2 skittering steps backward, hooves slipping slightly on the frost. Maya stopped. She lowered her gaze, focusing on the frosted grass near her boots. She counted her breaths. In, 1, 2, 3. Out. She could feel the cold seeping through her jeans. She could feel the weight of his stare. Minutes stretched, measured only by the frantic puff of the foal's breath, condensing in the air and the slow, steady rhythm of her own. The wind sighed through the pines. Somewhere far off, a crow cawed, a harsh, lonely sound. She didn't look up, but she took another slow step, then another. She reached the fence line. The foal hadn't moved. His trembling had lessened, replaced by a rigid stillness. His ears, no longer pinned flat, swiveled nervously, catching every rustle, every creak of the old farm waking up. Maya rested her forearms on the top rail of the fence, her posture relaxed, non-threatening. She kept her gaze lowered, fixed on the patch of earth just inside the paddock. She could see his shadow shift. He was turning his head, angling it slightly to keep her in his peripheral vision. The silence wasn't empty now. It was thick with his wariness, with her own guarded exhaustion. She felt a familiar ache in her chest, the one that tightened whenever she thought of her grandfather's empty chair by the stove, the one that whispered, "You're alone now." Looking at this creature, this trembling monument to her loss, felt like staring into a distorted mirror. Both survivors, both haunted, both stuck in the cold aftermath. A minute passed. 2. The sky lightened from charcoal to a bruised purple. Maya shifted her weight, the old wood of the rail creaking softly under her elbow. The foal flinched again, a small jerk of his head. But he didn't retreat. He stood his ground, his dark eyes now fixed directly on her hands resting on the rail. His nostrils flared once, twice, testing the air currents that swirled between them. Then, with infinite slowness, he lowered his head. Not all the way, just a fraction. His neck stretched out, tentative. He took a single, hesitant step forward, then another. His movements were stiff, cautious, each hoof placed with deliberate care on the frosted ground. He stopped about 5 feet from the fence, still well out of reach. He stretched his neck further, his muzzle reaching towards the weathered wood where Maya's sleeve rested. He sniffed. A long, deep inhalation. His whiskers brushed the rough timber near her elbow. Maya didn't move, didn't breathe. She felt the faint puff of his warm breath against the worn fabric of her coat sleeve. It smelled of sweet hay and milk, undercut by that ever-present faint tang of smoke that seemed woven into his coat. He sniffed again, longer this time. His ears flicked forward, then back, then settled, half-cocked, listening. His dark eye, large and liquid, was so close she could see the reflection of the paling sky in its depth. He wasn't looking at her face. He was focused entirely on her sleeve, on the scent trapped in the wool. He stood like that for a long moment, breathing her in. Then, with a soft, almost inaudible snort, he lifted his head slightly. He didn't retreat. He just stood there, closer than he'd ever voluntarily come before, his shoulder almost parallel to the fence rail, his head turned towards her. His trembling had stopped. There was a quietness about him now, a fragile stillness that hadn't been there before. The wind ruffled his short, dark mane. Maya felt a strange warmth bloom beneath the layers of her grief, small and tentative, like the first crocus pushing through frozen ground. It wasn't happiness. It was recognition, a silent acknowledgement passing between two wounded things. The light was strengthening, turning the frost into a field of tiny diamonds. The practical part of Maya's mind nudged her. Feed to measure, water to check, the endless chores that anchored her to this place of loss. She couldn't stand here forever, sharing breath with a ghost horse. She pushed herself gently back. From the fence rail, the movement was slow, deliberate. The foal's ears flicked back, but he held his ground, watching her. She turned away, her boots crunching on the frost as she headed back towards the farmhouse. The cold air bit at her cheeks. The weight of the day, of the loneliness, settled back onto her shoulders, heavier somehow after that fragile moment of connection. She took a dozen steps, the image of the foal's dark, watchful eye lingering in her mind. Behind her there was a soft thud on the frosted earth. Then another. Maya stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. She listened. The chai. Footsteps were hesitant, uneven, but steady. They followed the path she'd taken along the paddock fence. She turned her head just slightly, looking back over her shoulder. He was there. At the far corner of the paddock, his muzzle pressed against the top rail, watching her walk away. He didn't call out. He didn't whinny. He just stood, a dark silhouette against the rising dawn, his gaze fixed on her retreating figure, waiting. She didn't understand the flicker in his eye, the strange intensity of his silent vigil. Why follow? Why watch? She kept walking, the crunch of frost loud in her ears, the weight of his unseen gaze a tangible pressure between her shoulder blades. She didn't know why he followed, only that the emptiness behind her no longer felt entirely empty. The weeks that followed the foal's silent vigil at the paddock fence were a slow thaw. Maya still moved through the farm's routines with the careful precision of someone navigating a minefield of memory. But the crushing weight on her chest, the one that made drawing a full breath feel like lifting stone, had shifted. Not gone, just rearranged. She found herself lingering longer at the paddock rail each morning, a thermos of coffee cooling beside her boot. She didn't force interaction. She just stood, breathed, watched the gray colt with the mahogany hoof. He'd stopped freezing entirely when she approached. His trembling had lessened, replaced by a watchful stillness. He'd begun to explore the paddock more, nibbling tentatively at patches of winter grass exposed by the weak sun, though his head would snap up, ears swiveling like radar dishes. At any unexpected sound, a truck rumbling on the distant road, a branch cracking under its own weight in the woods, the ghost of the fire lived in his nerves. Maya started talking, softly, nonsense mostly, the price of grain, the stubborn latch on the tack room door, the way the crows seemed especially bold this winter. She avoided names, avoided the past, tense, avoided looking directly at the blackened scar where the old barn had stood. She kept her voice low, rhythmic, a steady murmur against the farm's silence. He listened, head often lowered, but one ear perpetually cocked towards her, a dark velvety satellite dish tuned to her frequency. Sometimes, when she mentioned the chill, he'd blow a soft, warm puff of air from his nostrils, a visible plume in the cold air, as if offering his own small comment. Then came the rakes. Maya needed to clear the last of the autumn leaves from the paddock's sheltered corner before the snows buried them. She gathered the tools from the rebuilt barn storage, a metal-tined rake and an older wooden one with wider spacing. She carried them to the paddock gate, the metal rake clattering slightly against the wooden handle of the other as she walked. The foal was at the far end. He saw her approach with the unfamiliar shapes and tensed muscles coiling beneath his gray coat. Maya leaned the wooden rake against the fence post outside the paddock, keeping her movements slow and predictable. She unlatched the gate, the familiar metallic groan now just a part of the morning soundtrack for him. He watched, head high, nostrils flared, but he didn't bolt. She stepped inside, carrying only the metal rake. She began working, dragging, the tines through the damp matted leaves near the fence line. The sound was harsh, metallic, a rhythmic scritch-scratch that echoed in the quiet paddock. She kept her back to the foal, focusing on the task, murmuring her usual stream of consciousness. Gotta get this done? Gonna snow soon? Stubborn? Things? She heard a sharp, high-pitched snort. Not the soft puff from before, this was alarm. She glanced over her shoulder. The foal was rigid, head thrust forward, eyes wide and white-rimmed, fixed not on her, but on the metal rake in her hands. His entire body vibrated with a terror she hadn't seen since the first dawns after the fire. He took a frantic step back, then another, his hooves slipping on the frosty ground. "Easy," Maya breathed, instantly lowering the rake, letting the head rest on the ground. "Easy now. It's just a rake, just a stupid rake." She kept her voice low and calm, but her own heart hammered against her ribs. The intensity of his reaction was startling. He wasn't scared of her. He was petrified of the tool. Why? Had the sound mirrored something? The screech of twisting metal in the fire? The frantic scrape of hooves on burning wood? He stood frozen 20 feet away, trembling violently again, his breath coming in ragged gasps, eyes locked on the fallen rake. Maya slowly backed away from it, moving towards the center of the paddock, putting distance between herself and the terrifying object. She crouched down, making herself small, non-threatening. "It's okay," she murmured over and over, the words feeling hollow against the wave of panic rolling off him. "Just me. Just Maya." It took long, agonizing minutes for his trembling to subside to mere shivers. He wouldn't look at the rake again. His gaze darted everywhere else, the sky, the trees, the fence line, anywhere but that spot. Maya abandoned the task. She carefully picked up the metal rake, holding it low and away from her body, and retreated from the paddock. As she closed the gate, she saw him finally lower his head, his body sagging with exhaustion from the surge of fear. He avoided the corner where the rake had been for the rest of the day. The incident gnawed at her. It wasn't just fear, it was a specific triggered terror. A piece of the puzzle of that night lived inside him, locked away but potent. She started noticing other subtle things. The smell of liniment on her hands after treating a nick on her own finger. He'd flinch away for a moment before cautiously returning. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of her beating dust from a rug. His ears would flatten briefly, his eyes darting towards the sound. He lived in a world of invisible tripwires. The breaking point came on a gray afternoon weeks later, sleet tapping a monotonous rhythm on the barn roof. Maya was in the small, cluttered tack room attached to the new barn, sorting through a box of her grandfather's old things she'd avoided for months. It smelled of leather oil, dust, and the faint, lingering sweetness of pipe tobacco. His scent. Her hands were steady as she lifted out worn bridles, a pair of cracked driving gloves, a faded blue bandana. Numbness was her armor. Then her fingers brushed something smooth and cool beneath a pile of old saddle pads. Wood. She pulled it out. It was a small, roughly carved horse, no bigger than her hand. Poplar wood, sanded smooth by years of handling. The craftsmanship was simple but unmistakably her grandfather's. The strong neck, the alert ears, the suggestion of powerful haunches. He'd whittled it decades ago, a model for a rocking horse he'd built for her mother. He'd called it his first draft. Tracing the familiar curves with her thumb, the numbness cracked. Not dramatically, but with a slow, relentless pressure that built behind her eyes. A pressure she hadn't felt since the funeral. She remembered his big, calloused hands holding the tiny carving, his voice rumbling as he explained the lines. "See here, Maya girl, that's the spirit. Gotta capture the spirit." A sob caught in her throat, sharp and sudden. She clenched her teeth, forcing it down. She wouldn't. She couldn't. She turned the little horse over. On its smooth belly, crudely carved but clear, was a single word. Benji. Benji, her grandfather's. Old roping horse. The one before the mare. The one he'd talked about with such fondness. Benji, who'd been gone long before Maya was born. Why carve Benji's name here? It made no sense. A memory flickered, elusive. Her grandfather sitting on the porch swing last summer, watching the pregnant mare graze. He'd been quiet, thoughtful. Reminds me of Benji, he'd said softly, almost to himself. That same look in the eye. Quiet fire. Maya had barely registered it at the time. Quiet fire. The foal. The gray colt with the watchful dark eyes that held terror, but also something else. That flicker of wary intelligence. That stillness that wasn't just fear. That spirit. Benji. The name echoed in the silent tack room. It wasn't just a name carved on a toy. It was the name he'd chosen. The name he'd given to the foal before the fire. A name whispered in quiet moments of anticipation. A name lost in smoke and chaos. A name meant for this trembling, damaged creature left behind. The pressure behind her eyes became a flood. The sobs she'd choked back erupted, raw and ragged, tearing from her throat. It was more than grief for her grandfather. It was grief for the future he'd planned, for the name he'd chosen, for the bright-eyed foal who should have known only safety and green pastures. It was the unbearable weight of carrying on in a world scorched by loss. She crumpled onto an upturned bucket, the little wooden horse clutched in her fist, her shoulders shaking with the force of tears she'd dammed up for months. She cried for the grandfather who'd saved a life with his last strength, for the mare lost in the smoke, for the terrified foal, and for the aching, hollow space inside herself. The sleet drummed on the roof, a cold counterpoint to the hot tears scalding her cheeks. She didn't hear the soft snort at first, or the hesitant shuffle of hooves on the concrete aisle outside the tack room door. She was lost in the storm. But then she felt it, a warmth, a presence. She lifted her tear-streaked face. He stood in the doorway, the gray colt, Benji. He hadn't entered the unfamiliar space of the tack room. He stood on the threshold, his head lowered slightly, his dark eyes fixed on her. Not with fear this time, with an intense, quiet focus. His nostrils flared, taking in the scent of her tears, her grief, the dust, the leather, the lingering ghost of pipe tobacco. He took one slow, deliberate step inside, then another. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that Maya could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the sweet hay on his breath. He didn't nuzzle, he didn't wicker, he simply stood, solid, present. His breathing, deep and slow, seemed to sync with her own hitching breaths. In, out. In, out. A steady, grounding rhythm in the dim, cluttered room. He lowered his head a fraction more, his soft muzzle almost level with her bowed head. He blew out a long, warm breath that stirred the hair near her temple. It wasn't an action. It was an offering. A silent anchor thrown into the turbulent sea of her sorrow. He stood there, unwavering as the storm within her slowly subsided, the sobs quieting to shuddering breaths, the tears slowing to a damp track on her skin. He stayed until the only sound was the sleet on the roof and the soft rhythm of their shared breath. He stayed until the crushing weight felt, for the first time, like something that could be borne. Weeks melted into a fragile spring. Green speared through the frost-bitten earth. The air lost its knife edge and carried the scent of damp soil and waking things. Maya still rose before dawn, but the walk to the paddock wasn't a burden. It was a quiet pilgrimage. She still murmured to the gray horse as she worked, but now the words sometimes carried his name. "Morning, Benji." "Easy, Benji. Just the wheelbarrow." He'd lift his head at the sound, his ears flicking forward. He didn't flinch at the metal rake anymore, though he still gave it a wide berth. The haunted look in his eyes hadn't vanished, but it had softened, overlaid with a growing curiosity. He'd meet her at the gate most mornings, stretching his neck over the rail to sniff her sleeve, her hair, the pocket where she sometimes hid an apple slice. He still startled at loud noises, but the rigid terror was less frequent, the recovery, quicker. He was learning the world wasn't only made of fire. Maya felt the change within herself too. The glacier of grief hadn't disappeared. It had calved, leaving deep fjords, but also open water. She found herself humming sometimes, an old tune her grandfather used to whistle while mending fences. The silence of the farm no longer echoed solely with absence. It held space for the rustle of Benji moving in his paddock, the contented munch of hay, the soft snort he gave when she scratched that spot just behind his withers. She started repairing the old chicken coop. She ordered seeds for the long-neglected kitchen garden. Small things, life things. One bright morning, the sun warm on their backs, Maya led Benji out of his paddock for the first time since the fire. Not far, just into the small grassy area beside the rebuilt barn. He walked beside her, his lead rope slack, his steps cautious but steady. He sniffed the new air, ears swiveling, taking in the chorus of birdsong. Maya stood with him, letting him graze the fresh shoots, feeling the sun soak into her bones. It was a simple act, but it felt monumental, a step out of the long shadow. Later, as she brushed him down outside his stall, her hand smoothing over the sleek gray coat that had finally lost the faintest whisper of smoke, she noticed something. She'd always focused on his near hind hoof, that polished mahogany beacon of his rescue. Now, as he shifted his weight, she saw the inside of his off foreleg. High up, near the elbow, was a patch of hair that grew in differently. Smoother, slightly paler, a scar, old, healed. She traced it gently with her fingers. It was a perfect match in size and shape to the scar on her own forearm, the one she'd gotten pulling a splintered board off her grandfather's boot the day after the fire, when the embers were still warm. She froze. The brush hung forgotten in her hand. Benji turned his head, nudging her gently with his muzzle, a soft question in his eyes. She looked from the scar on his leg to the faint silvery line on her own arm. 2 marks, one from pulling him from the fire, one from trying to save the man who had. Wounds inflicted in the same crucible of chaos. Proof of their shared desperate night. Proof of the invisible thread that had bound them long before she knew his name, long before she understood she wasn't alone in carrying the weight of that night. It wasn't a grand revelation. It was a quiet settling, a recognition of the map their bodies carried, a map of survival. She leaned her forehead against his warm neck, breathing in the scent of horse and hay and sun-warmed hide. He stood solid, accepting her weight, his breath a soft rhythm against her hair. The future wasn't promised. The scars, both seen and unseen, would always be there. But in that moment, standing in the dappled spring sunlight beside the horse, who bore the same hidden mark of their shared salvation, Maya understood something simple and profound. Healing wasn't about erasing the fire. It was about learning to carry its marks without being burned anew. It was about finding the quiet strength to stand beside another survivor, sharing the weight of memory, breathing the same air. Sometimes, the ones who carry you through the aftermath are the ones who bear the same scars you can't see. He shifted his weight, his mahogany hoof settling gently on the sun-warmed earth beside her worn boot. A survivor, a silent witness, a quiet, steady force named Benji. If this story of hidden scars and quiet strength found a place in your heart, hit subscribe. Leave a comment below. Tell us what moment resonated most, and press that bell icon. Because tomorrow brings another story waiting to be told, another heart waiting to be seen. Be here for it.